And finally, we have the NE versus SE signals. Now I'm going to start with NE1, which is naive eyes. And with naive eyes, what you see is that the perceptual region, which would be the eyelid, is taut or raised, while the perceptual area, which is the area between the eyelid and the brow, is soft. Now I use the word soft here in contrast to the word heavy, which is seen in SI1. So SI1 also has a taut pretarsal region here, but the difference is here that the perceptual area is heavy, whereas here the perceptual area is soft. And what do I mean by soft? The two PE functions, so that would be NE and SE, are always in possession of a level of alertness. And this goes back to what we talked about with PE, PE4 being alert/wide eyes. So what happens is you have somebody that's on the same axis as SI. They're in possession of the SI-NE holistic oscillation in the psyche. However, NE is, let's say, above SI in the case of here, which means that the attentiveness to the environment, the PE function, is prioritized above the SI function, which would cause the eyes to have a more alert look, and that pushes the what would otherwise be the heaviness of the SI brow off. And so any naive eyes, essentially, there are many ways to look at them. You could look at any eyes as more alert SI eyes, or you could look at SI eyes as less alert NE eyes. Nonetheless, the pattern between this axis is that the alertness will remain in the pretarsal area, which is what's going to remain taut, while the perceptual area is the one that's going to be increasingly more heavy, depending on how far up SI is or how heavy SI as the function is in the person's psyche. Now the same exact thing is true for the SE and I oscillation. So we're here at SE1, which is sharp eyes, and this is defined as the pretarsal area, so the eyelid, is soft, and the perceptual area, which is above the eyelid but below the brow, is taut. So as you can see here, this is raised because it's taut off the eye, but the eyelid itself remains somewhat hooded over the pupil, as you can see here. However, it is nowhere near the extent that we see it in NI1, which is the hypnotic eyes. If you notice here, the heaviness of the pretarsal region covers, in this case, about half of the pupil. And here we see about a third of the pupil. Nonetheless, the heaviness of the eye is significant because there's less attentiveness. Now I'm going to jump down next into SE2, which is taut eye area. So this would be the area below the eye and to the sides of the eye, this area over here. So if SE1 was related to the eyelid and the area above the eyelid but below the brow, then this next two pairs of signals relates to the area on the side of the eye and below the eye. Now remember how I mentioned that the perceptual area is taut in the eyes of SE and I types? Well, the perceptual area continues around the eye and is actually quite a circumference around it. So it also encircles this area here, which is why this is also called the perceptual area. So basically it's taut over here, but also taut over here. But we immediately run into an anatomical problem here, because every young person has this area taut by default because their skin is just plump and lush. So the younger a person is, the more challenging the signal might be. However, we can still distinguish a signal if we look at how the face contracts and where the tension goes in moments of animation. So this is a Keira Knightley demonstrating this GIF, and what we see is that she smiles halfway through this GIF, right? And that would be the incoming muscular contraction. Now, because the eye area is taut, in other words, the muscle here, the perceptual muscle, is contracted, then the muscles from the smile are clashing with the muscles of the perceptual area. You're going to see that clash here in this scrunching. It's almost as though it's fighting to give its real estate to the smile, and it's not letting that go. So there's that clash and tension. Remember how we talked about that same clash with the intense scowling? In the intense scowling, what we mentioned is that the frontalis muscle here clashes against the tension of the eye area to create this complexity. You see this complexity here, right? That's on the upper side of things. On the bottom side of things, we also see that complexity here in the intense muscle clashing. But this only makes sense if we contrast it against NE2, which is relaxed eye area. Now, as we mentioned, the preceptal area for NE is actually relaxed. Which means it is not putting up any fight, muscular fight against, let's say, incoming muscles from the face, such as from the smile. So what we read here is that the eye area will put up no muscular resistance from incoming muscle contractions such as smiles. Now notice here the ease in which the skin gives way to the smile. In other words, it crinkles. And it doesn't just crinkle because so does Keira Knightley's. That's a crinkle, but it's the kind of crinkle. There's a fissure that happens here because of the clash of what would say is two opposite parties fighting for the same territory. Here, instead, the eyes simply give way to the smile and they crinkle into the eye area. You can see it here also in Emma Watson. Next, we have SE3, which is amped perk up. We mentioned perk ups back here, which is a surprise expression. Basically, PE because it's exploring and absorbing information. Novelty is a very common theme, and surprise is novelty. At this moment, in SE3, the entire eye area, the entire orbital muscle is contracted open. From the very tip of the eyelid all the way up the eyebrow and beyond the eyebrow, all the area is just manically taut. And this is why I use the adjective amped, because it's a very amplified look. And this is contrasted against NE3, which is quirky perk up. And the word quirky I'll get to in a sec. But basically, the eyes here also do widen even more with surprise, but because they don't look intense or intimidating or amplified the way that they look in SE. And the qualia here, if I can insert a little, is that of a gentle amusement. Whereas here, it's, oh my god, that was intense, this is crazy. There's a lot of viscerality to the expression. It looks like they just saw something very profoundly shocking. And again, I know that's a qualia description, but if you're looking for the concrete description, basically, it's, as you see here in lights, the eye is perking up while the perk up does not enter into the preceptal area, which remains relaxed, even though the eye is absolutely wide open to the brim of the sockets. Next, we have the eye toggles. So both PE functions have eye toggling. With NE4, we see what is called brushstroke eye toggles. And it says here, the eyes toggle across the environment in a series of small but rapid saccades, often toggling circularly in all directions. Here's the circularity here. So what happens is the eyes make these very small little movements. The eyes, as it were, just trails across the scenery in a series of very small tiptoes. And so this is part of the reason that they're called brush stroke eye toggles. If you can imagine a painter gently going over a canvas with a series of little brush strokes here and there, that's somewhat of the movement that we see with the NE eyes. This is in contrast to the eyes of SC, which, as it says here, the eyes toggle back and forth between a few points, usually along the horizontal axis, and far from each other. So far from each other, for example, here and here, that's the distance, and here's a center point. So with Eminem here, you can see that he looks to the side here, and then he looks back, and then he looks to this side, and then he looks back. And this is essentially his pattern of movement. So the points are much fewer, as opposed to here, where, and this is more round usually, and they're smaller. With SE, the toggles are wider in their distance from one another, and they are fewer in their direction. So 1, 2, maybe 3 directions. In this case, you can see that the direction also is up, so it's not necessarily horizontal. He goes up and then back down, and then down, and then back to the center. But again, the points are few, and they have a discrete set direction. So often what you'll see is that they return back to the area where they had previously looked when they are toggling. Okay, now we've moved away from the eyes for a moment here, and we're going to look at the body. So the body energy is PE1, which is bubbling momentum, right? So the explorer functions don't just show up in the kind of toggling that happens or the kind of tension in the eyes, but also in this restless movement of the body, because the body is in a continuous state of motion, again, ongoing motion, but also in excitation. So excitation plus ongoing motion creates bubbling momentum. But bubbling momentum has two different forms, which relate to whether or not that momentum has what I call levity or gravity. In the case of any, there is levity. So what I mean by levity is buoyancy. With any 5, it reads here that the body sways softly at all times, as you can see here in Chris Corner, having a subtle upwards lift to the torso with each animation. And it's very subtle, but I want you to look at his torso and the way he's rocking. And there's this hopeful little lift to the torso, like right there. You saw that? Almost as if it had a little bit of helium inside of it. And a metaphor that I've used to describe this signal is as though the person is a balloon, a helium balloon, tied to a string on a chair. And although the wind might push it down a little, it's scooping itself back up because the helium is always kind of going in an upward direction, right? That would be the buoyant undercurrent, which is a baseline. That this is not a discrete movement, it's a baseline. The next signal is actually called the balloon effect. And this relates to the body sway. So the body sway is a more intense and direct pendulum swing in the PE gestures. And so to continue the metaphor of the balloon, if buoyant undercurrent can be compared to a helium balloon tied to a string on a chair, then the balloon effect is what happens when you cut the string, and it basically just takes off. So as you can see here, she swoops away, and here our member Shelley also just swings away, and there's a very playful upward lift to all the movements of the body. In contrast to these two signals, we have first SE5, which is bodily awareness. Now, bodily awareness is a variation of the bubbling momentum, but it's more a variation of the restlessness. So with SE, we see that the body is adjusting constantly, such as by fidgeting, scratching, or repositioning oneself, demonstrating a perpetual awareness of the body. Now, I hesitate to use some of these GIFs because it doesn't really matter whether or not they scratch the neck, whether or not they scratch the arm. The arm doesn't matter, the neck doesn't matter. No specific body part matters. What matters is the constant contact and awareness of the body. And basically, the body is continually being repositioned itself in real time because of this ergonomic awareness that SE has. So what you want to look for here is not simply the fact that they touched their face or their arm. It's whether or not the reason is related to repositioning oneself or fidgeting, or in other words, needing to, from an awareness of the body, needing to reposition to more ergonomic comforts. And then there's SE6, which is the gravity effect. This is in direct opposition to the balloon effect, which is the levity, which has an upward lift. SE6 has gravity. So the gravity effect is defined as gestures and animations will fall down by gravity as soon as they are finished. So for example, here, you see how that fell very seamlessly. Here also, the hand just kind of slips down. Everything is kind of moving towards the bottom. This could be the hands, but even the head, the torso, basically the body of the SE user is going towards the ground, and it doesn't tend to linger in a position, like the limbs don't linger in a position that is not supportable. All right, now we're back to the eyes for a few more signals. We touched on the eye quality primarily earlier in SEs 1, 2, and 3, and then the toggles in SE4. Next, we're going to talk about the eye-head parallel movement. So what you see here is an animation that was added. The red dots are the two eyes, basically where the two eyes are looking, and the blue circle is where the head is moving. So the eyes and the head are in the same position relative to each other. So notice that wherever his eyes are looking, his head trails with them as well, so that the eyes and the head have parallel movement. You can see it here also in George Lopez. His head and his eyes are moving in sync with each other, so that when he looks to the side, his eyes are looking there as well. When he moves his eyes this way, his head immediately moves, and there's no delay in the two. It's almost like they're connected. And this is in contrast to NE7, which is wandering eyes. So with wandering eyes, the eyes can move somewhere, and the head, it doesn't immediately go with them. It does. Like it does because they're face-centric and they are a P-lead. However, there's a syncopation. Syncopation is when a beat is off of the other beat. The best way I can describe this is using this GIF over here. So here we see in SE that the eyes, these two red marks, stay in the center of the circle, which is the head. In this blue circle is the head. Whereas with NE, they're off sync. So for example, the eyes move and then there's a trail, a syncopation, until the head catches up to them. In both cases, it's important to note that they are eye-centric. Yes, the head in both cases does follow the eyes, except in one, it follows them immediately, that would be a C, and in the other, it kind of trails behind. Now, one of the problems is that if the eyes of any move fast enough away, when the head doesn't have a chance to catch up every time it moves, then it can create this appearance that somewhat mimics the face centricity. So you got to watch out for that, because if you were to let the eyes of any play out, like this is actually a better GIF here, then it would actually cause the head to follow them. And in the future, I'll have 2 more GIFs here to show this a bit more clearly. Next, we have SE8, which is locked on eyes. Here, Eminem would be a better example. Now notice that his eyes are looking somewhere and he's not moving or deviating from where he's looking during the whole duration. They're basically fixed at that point. Now this does have some crossover with the zoned out stare of NI, except the difference again is that in NI, this is accompanied by the hypnotic eyes, which make the difference here. So the difference between locked on eyes and zoned out eyes is that these happen while the eyes themselves are attentive and alert, whereas with zoned out eyes, the person is drifting out of thought, out of time, out of environment. And this drift out of the environment is part of the going into the worldview, going into the memory recall. This is, in the case of the locked on eyes, this is not memory recall. This is actually part of the hyperfocus. It's part of the hyperfocus of SC to be really intensely looking at something for a duration of time. And I'm just going to go ahead and do the last 2 SE signals together to finish off the SE, starting with SE9, which is persistence effect. And it says here, persistent exposure to negative stimuli causes high irritation as SE remains present and can't detach, or can't distract, let's say. The reason it can't distract is because of SE's immersion, and immersion is part of SE's psychological habit.
Touch-ups, and you've got makeup on your face, hair on the back of you, wardrobe is pulling at you, you're not getting any air, and it's like panic attack central.
It was so normal, you know. I was just like, go to school, go to my room, or on weekends just sit in my room and do nothing. And I just aspired to do all these cool things, and I wanted to be more, and I knew that I was meant for more, but I'd just be stuck in that room just staring at the same 4 pink walls that my dad painted.
The psychological focus of the person will be turned to these types of data clusters. Part of the language expression of the SE type will be this callback to the persistence of stimuli that they've experienced or are experiencing. And lastly, for SE, we have here SE10, which is Vivid Realism, which is also a psychological cue, which says that events are described in the vividity they were experienced, tied to visceral body responses.
You know what I don't like? It's not a fear, but even thinking about it, it's giving me a weird feeling in my body and my mouth. Newspaper, print, yeah, just like having dry hands and touching a newspaper. Ugh! Or having like hangnails and like a woolly kind of blanket or sweater. That's not an irrational fear. It's just so gross to me to think about.
Sex scenes are great. I'm not gonna pretend it's like not fun. A lot of my co-stars recently have been guys, sexy guys my age that are really respectful and cool.
So there it was. The details are very explicit. They're described very vividly, and you can tell that they affect the person psychologically. Now, to contrast these last two signals, persistence effect relates more to the persistence or the continual exposure to a certain stimuli and how that affects the person, to have continual exposure to that stimuli. SE10 relates more to the quality of the stimuli, the vividity and the coloration, the richness of it. So SE9 happens because of the constant inability to turn off immersion in the environment and how that affects the person. And SE10 is more specifically their tendency to describe, let's say, a single experience with a deep richness of color and contrast. And these two are, in a sense, the way that the SE function comes to explain the world that they are inhabiting or experiencing. And that completes the SE signals. But we haven't finished the NE ones. So we left off at NE8, which is parodies. The person will create imitations or caricatures using their body. Jim Carrey is famous for using his face to imitate certain actors. So if we pay attention here, look at that right there, that look, that's a parody. And so is that one. That's here in this GIF, you see this played out in the form of the hands and her wobbling. But this may also involve audio if the parody involves, let's say, imitating a person's voice or imitating a certain accent. There's a level of symbology involved here. This can be positioning oneself in a certain pose. For certain expressions, again, like if it looks like Clint Eastwood, that's kind of a meme. So this caricature or meme is enacted with a level of playfulness and artistic freedom, and that's essentially what the parody is. Now, like every behavior, a version of it exists in the opposite. So there's a SE style of parody that they sometimes do, but it's not included in the codifier because in comparison to the frequency and intensity of parodies in the NE user, it's negligible. So more often than not, these little parodies and skits are an indication of NE functioning. However, it doesn't mean that every person that does a skit is evidencing NE, of course. And that's why we use these various cues in order to triangulate and isolate what is actually happening under the hood of the person. So the last two signals for NE are also psychological, just like the last two of SE. But you guys are all familiar with tangent hopping. It's the same video as has been on this website before, but I encourage you to watch the video in full. It does a better job of explaining it, but this video is a summary. So I'm going to skip to number 10, which is indiscriminate correlating. And this is defined as highly distant mental objects are equivocated in real time based on shared properties. Such as if I take two words together, like for example, rocket ships and turtles, and I say rocket ship turtle. That's an image in my mind now. It's a turtle that, okay, maybe he takes his legs and he puts them inside his shell, and then out of his shell comes out these two jet streams of fire, and those propel the turtle forward, and it's a rocket ship turtle. That's an indiscriminate correlation. Two distant mental objects are equivocated in real time based on shared properties.
What the heck is this thing? Most people eat it like a soup, out of a bowl with a spoon. But is it a soup? The word soup comes from words that originally meant to absorb liquid, which dry cereal left in milk too long will do. But words change. What if cereal is actually a type of salad, and milk is just a dressing? Or maybe dry cereal is the actual meal, and milk is just a condiment or a coating. Adding milk to dry cereal might be like adding ketchup to French fries, or icing a cake.
But what if all the ancient Greek sculptures are actually all victims of Medusa?
So the host of Vsauce here in AnyLead, he basically does a what-if experiment as to what if adding milk to cereal is the same thing as adding ketchup to French fries. So here he's taking milk and cereal and equivocating it to French fries and ketchup by this kind of acrobatic association between the words that are constructing these thought trails. And here Aurora asks, what if all the Greek statues are actually victims of Medusa? So again, here there's a play with the concepts. There's a suspension of physicality, and the thinking is only based on the caricatures, and there's a relationship between the caricatures that is kind of theorized. So if statues are made of stone and Medusa turns into stone, then what if statues weren't actually carved, but they're actually people that were petrified? So that's the kind of indiscriminate correlating that he's doing. And as you can tell, this is a very different kind of mental activity than what we see in the SE types, which have vivid realism and the persistence effect. And all these complete the NE and SE signals, which completes the 110 signals of the codifier. But for those who are absolutely new to cognitive type, stay tuned because there's going to be a series coming out explaining the fundamentals in a more user-friendly video format, describing the theory's core tenets, and then how we get to places like these signals here. And thank you guys so much for watching.